We've been through so many of these nights before. A last-minute media conference called by the president during the day. And, of course, tonight he's announced a move to lockdown level 3. What does it mean for you, for your family? Well, some of the restrictions that we've become quite affair with now are just going to be, we're just getting back to more tighter restrictions, less movement effectively. That's really the crux of it. The big questions now are around the country's vaccination program. How quickly are we going to be able to get reliable vaccines into the country and into people's arms before we have some sense of stability going forward? And of course, in studio with me tonight, Thabo Mdluli and Xolani Mbanjwa, who is our business editor. Let's take you quickly to Professor Koleka Mlisana, who is the co-chair of the COVID-19 Ministerial Advisory Committee, and South African Liquor Brand Owners Association CEO, Kurt Moore. Professor Koleka, let me begin with you tonight. Firstly, how much of the recommendation, or how much of the restrictions rather, that have been announced by the president actually stemmed from the advice given by you as the Ministerial Advisory Committee?
Good evening, Kathy, and good evening to everybody in the studio. Thank you for having me. There's actually a significant amount of what we had submitted to the acting Minister of Health, came through, the president tonight. So, because, obviously we were concerned with the way that the third wave, is going on and just the increase in the number of infections. And so we felt it was important for the country to go into tighter restrictions. So, a relatively amount of what he actually announced today came from the MEC. Thank you.
Now, Professor Mlisana, you used one, would say maybe two of the tools that are available, limiting internal movement, that is curfew. People would be at home a little bit sooner, but also you have banned well, not really banned completely, but limited the number of those who are gathering, or you recommended to the president to do that, and he seems to have taken that on. What is the thinking around the limiting the number of days for sale of alcohol for off-site consumption? What informs that decision? Because, liquor traders keep saying these decisions are made by the advisory committee, not based on science.
Well, the issue really around liquor is always the fact that when people consume alcohol, then they tend not to actually adhere to the non-pharmaceutical interventions. And I think everybody really sees that a lot of times. And also, people become unruly in that they no longer stick to the numbers that are prescribed. They no longer use the masks that they should be using. And so it really just becomes very, very difficult to manage a rowdy and, a group where people are actually using alcohol excessively. And that is why we therefore feel if there can really be control of the sale of alcohol, so that people, if they want to consume alcohol, they can consume it in the comfort of their homes and not outside, because then it becomes really, truly very, very difficult to stick to these NPIs. And as the president highlighted tonight, really, when we're looking at these increasing numbers, really the only thing that's causing the numbers to increase, it just means we're not adhering to interventions, because that's the only way that we're getting infection from one person to the next person. And so we really need to be strict on that. And it mustn't just really be around alcohol, but also it's got to be for every South African, because whether you're going to the mall, we need to be careful that we are social distancing. Whether you walk into whatever store that you walk in, make sure you're using the mask, appropriately. So really, it's, for me, as far as I'm concerned, is the responsibility of every South African.
Kurt, the tighter restrictions now being put, particularly on the days of the sale of alcohol, how do you receive that, and whether you think it will have some kind of impact on the sector?
Yeah, Thabo, thank you very much for having me, and good evening to your listeners. Look, I think the news from the president this evening is something that And we appreciate that the decisions that the President and the Medical Advisory Council have to make are very difficult decisions. Balancing lives and livelihoods is crucial. We need our economy to keep growing, even during these difficult times. We need to save lives, but the livelihoods of those employees in our sector in particular. Now, I think from an industry perspective, and the speaker mentioned earlier that some of the considerations that was taken was because people, when they're intoxicated, may not behave appropriately. And I think in a restaurant and bar sector, we certainly want to work with those retailers, and the taverners have also committed themselves to try to make sure that there's compliance with the regulations. We have agreed to introduce what we call community patrollers, up to 500 in hotspots, trying to help the police to make sure we don't have violations of the regulations. But what obviously we would love government to sit down and explain to us, and I hear the explanation. We need, if people are to sit at home and consume responsibly, then it begs the question, why then do we close off the retailers over the weekend? And those questions the retailers have been asking repeatedly each time government has made the decision not to allow sales over the weekends, because people will go and purchase and go consume it at home.
Yeah.
So that is something that we've always repeatedly asked government to consider and to explain the rationale for us. I think for us,
I suppose, Dr. Mlisana, you might want to just quickly weigh in on that as Kurt is raising it.
Well, I mean, really, I would agree with Kurt in that that's probably something that needs to be discussed, but it really just becomes the issue of whether people can be controlled or not. And I think hearing him stating the measures that they're taking to make sure that they monitor people and their use of use of liquor, it's going to be important for us then to see how that monitoring system is working. And then, if there's need to sit down around the table, discuss these things and review what needs to be reviewed, I don't think anybody is actually closed to that discussion.
Professor Kollega, one of the things that has been said by the President tonight is that when he looks at the infections in Gauteng, there seems to be an indication that for the third wave, the level of infections could well surpass that of the second wave. Speak to me a little bit about the projections that you as the Ministerial Advisory Committee are working around right now, and the extent to which this third wave in certain parts of the country could well be much more severe than what we've seen.
Okay, yeah, thank you for that question, Kathy. Actually, if you're looking at Gauteng specifically, if we look at the first wave in Gauteng and the second wave, you will realize that actually the numbers were very similar. The waves are very similar as opposed to what we saw in the KZN province, for example. KZN and Western Cape, the first wave was lower and the second wave was much higher. What that means is that a lot more people got infected during the second wave in KZN and in the Western Cape, but we did not see that in Gauteng. Now, what it therefore means is that if you're looking at the number of people who are then at risk for infections, it means that a lot more in Gauteng because there weren't as many, obviously proportional to the province's population. There weren't as many people that got infected during the first waves. So there are a lot more people who are currently at risk. That's number one. And then the second part is if you're just looking at the previous, the last 2-3 days of number of infections in Gauteng, starting from Thursday, I think it was Wednesday or Thursday last week, really there's just been this, a steep increase. And if you superimpose the two waves, the first and the second wave, they're very similar in Gauteng. And where we're sitting now with the third wave, if you put in the third line of the third wave, it is almost reaching the tip and it's still going very high. And that's why, as the President correctly predicts, that we are likely to have a higher peak during this third wave in Gauteng, looking at the information that I've just shared now. And so we really don't know when when that peak is going to be reached. But looking at the numbers, it's still, just rocketing high.
So does that mean that we are likely to see a variation of the lockdown restrictions in Gauteng going forward, especially if this province is going to be bearing the brunt of the burden of COVID-19?
I'm assuming when you talk variation, you mean variation with the different provinces.
Yes, especially in terms of the lockdown restrictions. So are we likely to see Gauteng back at level 5 when the other provinces stay at level 3, for example?
Okay. Well, I would think before we go to the next level, what we really, the way to do it would be to look at the responses, the behavioral responses with the level 3, restrictions right now. Because if we really can adhere to the interventions that have been prescribed, we might see that the peak getting its peak, we might actually reach the peak much earlier, and that would be good, because then it would mean we don't need to go to a further restriction. But also what we want to bear in mind is it is good for the whole country to go on to level 3, so that even the provinces that still don't have as many infections as Gauteng, for example, they can contain their number of cases so they don't reach that same level, because then it's going to ensure that the services within hospitals can then be focused in 1 or 2 or limited number of provinces. We really don't want a situation where the whole country gets into a massive third wave and as a result we cannot cope. So I would say let's adhere to level 3 and see how soon we get the peak and how soon we can turn the wave around, and that might mean we don't need to go further on.
Your extended version of News at Prime following the President's address on the government's interventions in curbing the numbers of COVID-19 infections in the country. This as we're seeing a resurgence. One could technically say we are in a third wave, as the 7-day rolling average has now surpassed a third of what we've seen in the second wave of infections. We're joined now by Professor Koleka Mlisana, who is the co-chair at the COVID-19 Ministerial Advisory Committee. Also, South African Liquor Brand Owners Association CEO Kurt Moore. Joining us now on the conversation, Chief Economist and Thought Leadership Executive at IQ Business, Sfiso Skenjana. Sfiso, good to have you with us as well today. Talk to me about what the sector feels as we are, of course, moving and showing glimpses of shoots of recovery. And what would the industry be feeling right now with these kind of restrictions now coming back on?
Yeah, I think if you just look at the most recent GDP numbers, they show you that a lot of the growth that we did see was coming out of the mining sector, and that wasn't largely internally focused, was because of global developments on the commodity prices. And then you also saw that it was the financial sector that was a net contributor. A lot of the sectors that are highly going to be impacted by this, and the wholesale and trade, you did see a little bit of an uptick, but certainly now this kind of move certainly continues to put a bit of pressure there. We know also the high energy users in the country, which is also mining and sectors in manufacturing, while being given now 100 megawatts to self-generate. However, they still need to make those investments themselves, and so I think we are in a space where the economy is largely pressurized. And I think we need to be a little bit more innovative in terms of how we respond to the health pressure, as well as trying to ensure that we create some sustainability from an industry level. We've seen liquidation numbers also going up from a Stats SA, as well as inequality numbers worsening, unemployment looking terrible. And when you see something like this, which we often refer to as a Pigouvian tax, which is a tax simply around trying to reduce negative externalities, it often results actually in a worsened outcome for people who are more marginalized from an income point of view. And so we need to be really mindful in how we make these choices now responding to the pandemic.
Sfiso, we've been here so many times before with different levels of restrictions. How much longer can South Africa's economy take of this management of the pandemic through, these restrictions and not through vaccinations? Because even if you listen to the IMF, the World Bank, the Reserve Bank, they all point to vaccinations as one of the hindrances to economic growth and recovery. How much longer can the South African economy take of this, management of this pandemic through these means?
It certainly is going to be continuing to be a very big pressure point, and I don't think we can take it much longer. We're already seeing, in terms of the tax base from a corporate income tax point of view, really starting to dwindle. And that means the country is starting to rely on individuals to fund its tax base. And that's one of the things. We're seeing, of course, movements around the democratization of the technology for vaccine manufacturing. India, South Africa, France now pushing the weight around release the intellectual property there so that countries like South Africa can localize their manufacturing. Those are some of the things that certainly can help us in breathing some resilience into our health system. But I think over and above that, we also need transparency around the process, because organizations struggle to plan and make investment decisions when they don't know what can happen and can't happen. And as a result, you're seeing it in the employment choices that organizations are making. They're employing a lot less people on a permanent basis, a lot more on a temporary basis. And also you're seeing in the kind of property, plant and equipment investment that they're making, that they're actually holding back on that. And so these are all the things that organizations who are particularly in the manufacturing sector can't make investment decisions when they don't know the process that is used in order to reach certain decisions coming out of the Command Council. And so I think that certainly will be something that can breed some confidence into corporates as well as the individuals who are driving the decisions within those corporates.
Kurt, let me come to you. I sense a huge sigh of relief from your side that things were not as bad. The restrictions are not as bad as would have been anticipated. But have you quantified as a sector how much you lose in sales under each lockdown level? Because we've been here before.
Yes, Thabo, we have been here before. Look, we've had a number of studies done to quantify the losses. It's much easier to quantify it during the bans. But we looked over last year's, it was almost 3 months of either partial restrictions or full bans. The industry lost about 36 billion rand in sales. Excluding excise tax, the fiscus lost about 29 billion rand in taxes from industry, and those are huge numbers. We also looked at some of the illicit activity. Now, in 2017, we did a study. That study, we followed that up with another study in 2020, and it shows that the sale of alcohol, when the legal trade is restricted or is banned and not allowed to operate, the sale of alcohol goes into illicit channels. And our estimate is around about 11.3 billion rands worth of excise was lost to government as a result of illicit trade during 2020. Restrictions and bans on the sale of alcohol is not a permanent or a sustainable solution. Sfiso hit the nail on the head in terms of the vaccine rollout. I mean, that's our only way out of this pandemic. And I'd love to hear more from government in particular around the rollout of the vaccine. We've said as a sector, we can assist in terms of the huge logistical challenge. Wherever we can, we're willing to cooperate. When we go to NEDLAC as the industry, we also sit with the Consumer Goods Council of South Africa, and their members are willing to assist government in this rollout of the vaccine. And truly, that's our only way out of this pandemic. Restrictions are certainly not going to help the economy, our industry, or the citizens of this country.
Kurt Moore, we appreciate your time. Thank you for joining us tonight here on News at Prime. Professor Kollega Mlisana, we appreciate your time. She's the co-chair of the COVID-19 Ministerial Advisory Committee, as well as the chief economist at IQ there, and thought leadership, Sfiso Skenjane. And let me thank my panel as well. for joining me and keeping me company today.
I